The sun dipped behind the mountains of Colorado, casting long shadows across the wooden platform where Rose Whitman stood in her cream-colored wedding dress, her small hands trembling around a bouquet of white lilies. The gathered townspeople of Valentine whispered among themselves as minutes stretched into an hour. And still, no sign of Edward Calloway, the man who had promised to marry her despite the child growing in her womb. Rose felt the blood drain from her face as Reverend Thompson approached her, his expression heavy with pity. "My dear," he said gently, "I believe we must accept that Mr. Calloway isn't coming." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and Rose could hear the judgment in their voices. "Poor thing," someone said, "5 months along and abandoned." Another voice, less sympathetic, "That's what happens when a woman gives herself before marriage." Tears stung Rose's eyes as she realized the full horror of her situation. 22 years old, pregnant, and now publicly humiliated in front of the entire town. Her parents had passed 2 winters ago in the influenza outbreak, leaving her with no family to turn to. The small house she'd been renting would soon be beyond her means without a husband's income. As the crowd began to disperse, Rose stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. Her vision blurred with tears that refused to fall. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. "I'll be your husband." The voice came from behind her, deep and steady. The crowd fell silent again as a tall man stepped forward, his worn cowboy hat held respectfully against his chest. Rose recognized him, Preston Garrett, the quiet, hard-working rancher who owned land north of town. He wasn't like the other cowboys who came through Valentine. He didn't drink to excess or cause trouble. He kept to himself, worked hard, and was respected if not well known. Preston's blue eyes held her steadily. "If you'll have me, Miss Whitman, I'll marry you today." Rose stared at him, speechless. They'd spoken perhaps 3 times in the 2 years since she'd moved to Valentine. He'd bought bread from her at the bakery where she worked, tipped his hat politely, and gone on his way. Why would this man offer to marry her when the father of her child had fled? "Mr. Garrett," Reverend Thompson said carefully, "this is a rather unorthodox proposal. Perhaps you should think about—" "I've thought enough," Preston said, his eyes never leaving Rose's face. "No woman deserves to be left standing alone on her wedding day." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Miss Whitman, I have a good home, a stable income. Your child would want for nothing. I'm offering a practical arrangement, nothing more." Rose swallowed hard. She had no illusions about love. That dream had died when Edward disappeared. But Preston Garrett was offering her respectability, security for her child, a chance to hold her head up again in town. "Why?" she whispered. "You barely know me." A shadow crossed his weathered face. "I know what it's like to face the world alone. No one should have to do that." The Reverend looked between them. "Miss Whitman, you don't have to decide this moment." "Yes," Rose said suddenly, surprising herself. "Yes, I will marry you, Mr. Garrett." Murmurs rippled through the remaining crowd. Preston nodded once, then stepped up beside her where Edward should have stood. Reverend Thompson hesitated, then opened his Bible. "Well then, dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." The ceremony passed in a blur. Rose heard herself repeating vows to a virtual stranger, felt the cool metal of a simple gold band. Preston must have been wearing it on a chain around his neck slide onto her finger. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Preston didn't kiss her, merely offered his arm to lead her down the steps. His wagon waited nearby, a strong bay horse in the traces. Preston helped her up, careful of her dress and her condition, then climbed up beside her. The few remaining townspeople watched in silence as he clicked to the horse and guided the wagon out of town. "I have a ranch about 5 miles north," he said after they'd traveled in silence for several minutes. "It's not fancy, but it's solid. There's a bedroom you can have to yourself." "I'll take the small room off the kitchen." Rose gripped her bouquet, still trying to comprehend how quickly her life had changed. "Mr. Garrett, Preston," he corrected. "Reckon you should use my given name now." "Preston," she tried again. I don't know how to thank you for what you did back there." His hands remained steady on the reins. "No need for thanks. It was the right thing to do. Even so, most men wouldn't have done it." He was quiet for a long moment. "I'm not most men, I suppose." They traveled the rest of the way in silence. As they crested a small rise, Preston's ranch came into view, a sturdy two-story house with a wide porch, a large barn, and several corrals where horses grazed. It was modest but well kept, speaking of a man who took pride in his property. "It's lovely," Rose said softly. Preston nodded. "Been working on it for 6 years now, started with just the barn and a one-room cabin." He guided the wagon to the front of the house. "Home now, I guess, for both of us." He helped her down, then gathered her small valise that contained the few possessions she'd brought for her honeymoon with Edward. As she followed Preston up the porch steps, Rose placed a protective hand over her swollen belly. Whatever else might come, her child would have a roof over its head and a name that wasn't tainted by scandal. Preston opened the door and stepped aside to let her enter first. The interior was simple but comfortable, a sitting room with a stone fireplace, sturdy furniture, and to her surprise, bookshelves filled with books. "Kitchen's through there," Preston said, nodding toward a doorway. "Upstairs are the bedrooms, I'll show you." He carried her valise up the stairs to a large bedroom at the front of the house. A 4-poster bed with a patchwork quilt dominated the space, along with a dresser and washstand. "This will be your room," he said, placing her bag on a chair. "There's a smaller bedroom next door that can be for the baby when it comes." Rose nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The thoughtfulness of this stranger, this husband, was almost more than she could bear after Edward's betrayal. Preston shifted awkwardly. "I'll let you get settled. I need to see to the horses and evening chores. There's food in the kitchen when you're hungry." "Thank you," Rose managed. "For everything?" He nodded once, then left her alone in what was now her bedroom. Rose sank onto the edge of the bed, finally allowing the tears to fall. She cried for the love she'd thought she had with Edward, for the child who would never know its real father, for the shame she'd felt standing abandoned at the altar. And finally, she cried with relief that, against all odds, she'd found safety in the most unexpected place. Downstairs, Preston Garrett leaned against the barn door, staring up at the bedroom window where a light now glowed. He wasn't sure what had possessed him to step forward and offer marriage to Rose Whitman. He'd admired her from afar since she'd come to Valentine, her kind smile as she handed him bread at the bakery, the graceful way she moved despite her advancing pregnancy, her quiet dignity even as gossips whispered about her condition. But there was more to it than that. There was the memory of his own mother, abandoned with 3 children when his father decided mining prospects in California were more appealing than family responsibilities. There was the knowledge of what it meant to be defenseless in a world that showed little mercy to the vulnerable. Preston removed his hat and ran a hand through his dark hair. He hadn't planned on marriage, not after Catherine had died in childbirth 7 years ago, taking their infant son with her. He'd built this ranch alone, content with his solitary life. Now there would be a woman in his house and soon a child. He wasn't fool enough to think it would be easy. Rose was carrying another man's baby, and she'd been in love with someone else only hours ago. But he'd made his choice, and Preston Garrett was a man who stood by his decisions. He'd give Rose the protection of his name and provide for her and her child. He'd be fair and kind. And maybe in time they might find some measure of companionship, if not the love she'd hoped for with Edward Calloway. For now, that would have to be enough. Rose awoke the next morning to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows. For a moment she was disoriented, then the events of the previous day came flooding back. The empty place beside her at the altar, the whispers, and Preston Garrett's unexpected proposal. She placed a hand on her rounded belly. "Well, little one," she whispered, "it seems we have a new home." Rose dressed in one of her simple day dresses. Thankfully, she hadn't packed all her clothing for the honeymoon and made her way downstairs. The house was quiet, but she could smell coffee brewing. In the kitchen, she found a pot of coffee on the stove, still hot, and a note on the table written in a surprisingly elegant hand. Had to check the north pasture fences. Help yourself to anything in the kitchen. We'll be back midday. Preston Rose prepared herself a simple breakfast of bread and preserves she found in the pantry, then set about exploring her new home. The kitchen was well equipped, but showed the signs of a bachelor's residence, functional, but lacking certain touches a woman might add. The sitting room contained those surprising bookshelves filled with volumes of history, adventure tales, and even some poetry. She climbed the stairs again and discovered a third bedroom she hadn't noticed the night before. Opening the door, she found it was set up as a study, with a desk near the window overlooking the ranch. What caught her eye, however, was a photograph on the desk, a portrait of a young woman with dark hair and a gentle smile. Beside it lay a small, carved wooden horse. Rose closed the door quietly, feeling as though she'd intruded on something private. Clearly, there were things about her new husband she didn't know. By midday, she had familiarized herself with the house and decided to prepare a proper meal. She found a well-stocked pantry and root cellar, with preserved vegetables, smoked meats, and even some dried fruits. By the time she heard hoofbeats in the yard, she had a hearty stew simmering and fresh biscuits in the oven. Preston entered, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. He stopped short when he smelled the food. "You didn't need to cook," he said, looking uncomfortable. "I wanted to," Rose replied. "It seemed the least I could do." He nodded, washing his hands at the sink. "Smells good, haven't had home cooking in a while." They ate at the kitchen table, an awkward silence between them broken only by the clink of cutlery against plates. "This is fine stew," Preston said finally. "Thank you," Rose nodded. "Your kitchen is well stocked, better than I expected for a man living alone." "I like to eat well," he said with a slight shrug. "Never saw the point in living on beans and hardtack like some cowboys." Rose gathered her courage. "Preston, I think we should talk about arrangements." He set down his fork. "What kind of arrangements?" "Well, we're married, but we hardly know each other. And there's the baby coming in about 4 months. She twisted her new wedding ring nervously. "I need to know what you expect from me." Preston considered her question carefully. "I expect you to be comfortable here, to make this your home. When the baby comes, I'll help as I can, though I don't know much about infants." He paused. "As for the other aspects of marriage, I don't expect anything from you in that regard, not unless you want it someday." Relief flooded through Rose. "Thank you for your honesty. I'm not ready for that." "After Edward, she broke off, unable to continue. "You don't need to explain," Preston said quietly. "You loved him. That doesn't just disappear, even after what he did." "I thought I loved him," Rose corrected. "Now I'm not sure I ever knew him at all." Preston nodded. "Time has a way of revealing truths we'd rather not see." He rose and carried his plate to the sink. "I need to finish mending that fence. Is there anything you need from town? I can ride in tomorrow." "Actually," Rose said hesitantly, "I should go to town myself. I need to collect the rest of my things from my rented room, and I should let Mrs. Holloway at the bakery know I won't be returning to work right away." Preston frowned. "People will talk. People always talk," Rose said with a hint of bitterness. "Besides, I can't hide out here forever." "No," he agreed, "you can't. We'll go tomorrow morning then." That night, Rose lay awake in her new bedroom, listening to the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the house. She could hear Preston moving about downstairs, his footsteps steady and measured. Despite everything, she felt safer than she had in months. There was something solid about Preston Garrett, something trustworthy that Edward had lacked beneath his charming exterior. She placed her hands on her belly, feeling the baby shift and kick. "We'll be all right," she whispered. "We have a home now, and a name." The trip to Valentine the next morning was exactly as uncomfortable as Rose had anticipated. Preston drove the wagon, his face impassive as they passed farms and ranches on their way into town. Rose sat beside him, her back straight, determined not to show how nervous she felt. People stared as they made their way down the main street. Preston stopped the wagon in front of Mrs. Holloway's bakery first. "I'll wait here," he said. "Take your time." Rose nodded gratefully and made her way inside. Mrs. Holloway, a kind woman in her 50s who had always treated Rose well despite her pregnancy, looked up in surprise. "Rose, my dear, we weren't expecting you today. After yesterday." "I came to tell you I won't be returning to work for a while, Mrs. Holloway," Rose said. I got married yesterday, as you may have heard." Mrs. Holloway's eyes widened. "To Preston Garrett, that's what everyone's saying, but I could hardly believe it." "It's true," Rose confirmed. "He's been very kind to me." Mrs. Holloway studied her face. "Well, that's certainly a turn of events. Garrett's a good man, from what I know, keeps to himself, but he's always fair in his dealings." She reached out to squeeze Rose's hand. "You know you always have a position here if you need it. Even after the baby comes." "Thank you," Rose said, genuinely touched. "That means a great deal to me." After saying goodbye to Mrs. Holloway, Rose crossed the street to the boarding house where she'd been renting a room. As she climbed the stairs to gather her belongings, she heard whispers following her. "Married to Garrett not 24 hours after being jilted. Wonder if he knows the baby isn't his. Always seemed like such a sensible man before this." Rose held her head high, refusing to acknowledge the gossip. In her small room, she quickly packed her clothing, a few books, and the quilt her mother had made for her as a child. There wasn't much else. Her life in Valentine had been modest. As she descended the stairs with her bundle, she nearly collided with Mabel Turner, one of the town's most notorious gossips. "Well, Rose," Mabel said with false sweetness, "quite the dramatic few days you've had. Poor Edward must be devastated to have missed his own wedding." Rose felt anger flare within her. "Mr. Calloway made his choice, Mrs. Turner, and I've made mine." "Indeed you have," Mabel replied, "and so quickly too. One wonders if perhaps you and Mr. Garrett had an understanding all along." Before Rose could respond, a deep voice came from behind her. "Mrs. Turner." Preston stood at the bottom of the stairs, his expression neutral but his eyes hard. "My wife has had a trying couple of days. I'd appreciate it if you'd step aside so she can pass." Mabel's face flushed, but she moved aside. Preston took Rose's bundle and offered his arm. With as much dignity as she could muster, Rose placed her hand on his arm and allowed him to escort her out to the waiting wagon. "Thank you," she whispered once they were outside. Preston nodded. "People can be cruel when they don't understand something. And they certainly don't understand why you married me," Rose said. He helped her into the wagon. "They don't need to understand. It's between you and me." As they drove back through town, Rose was acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. But Preston seemed completely unaffected, his gaze fixed straight ahead, his posture relaxed but proud. At the general store, Preston stopped again. "We need supplies." "Would you like to come in or wait here?" Rose hesitated, then squared her shoulders. "I'll come with you." Inside the store, Mr. Paulson greeted them with surprise. "Mr. Garrett, Mrs. Garrett, congratulations on your marriage." "Thank you," Preston said simply, as if there was nothing unusual about their situation at all. He began selecting items they needed: flour, sugar, coffee, a bolt of fabric that he added after a questioning glance at Rose, who nodded her approval. While Preston settled the bill, Rose found herself before a display of baby items: small blankets, soft flannel for diapers, tiny knitted booties. Her hand hovered over a small wooden rattle. "You need these things?" Preston asked, appearing at her side. "Not yet, but soon," Rose replied. "I was starting to set aside a few items before." Preston reached past her and took the rattle, along with a soft blanket and several yards of the flannel. He added them to their purchases without comment. As they left the store, Rose spotted a familiar figure across the street: Edward Calloway's father, Judge Calloway, staring at them with open hostility. The older man had never approved of his son's relationship with the orphan daughter of a farmer, and had likely been relieved when Edward disappeared rather than marry her. Preston followed her gaze and stiffened slightly. "Would you like me to have a word with him?" "No," Rose said quickly. No, that won't help anything. Preston studied her face for a moment, then nodded. As you wish. On the ride home, Rose found herself stealing glances at her new husband. Preston Garrett was not a handsome man in the way Edward had been, with his golden hair and easy smile. Preston was all angles and weathered skin, his face serious, his dark hair beginning to show threads of silver at the temples, though he couldn't be much past 30. But there was a steadiness to him, a quiet strength that Rose found herself grateful for. What will people in town say about you now? She asked suddenly. Won't this hurt your reputation, your business? Preston kept his eyes on the road. People will talk for a while, then find something new to gossip about. As for business, I don't rely on the goodwill of Valentine. I sell my horses to the army and to ranchers throughout Colorado. My reputation as a horseman speaks for itself. Even so, Rose persisted, you've taken on a burden that isn't yours. Preston glanced at her then, his blue eyes intent. You're not a burden, Rose, neither is your child. Something in his tone silenced her questions. They rode the rest of the way in comfortable quiet, the spring sunshine warming them as the wagon rolled toward home. Over the next weeks, Rose and Preston settled into an unexpected routine. Each morning, he rose before dawn to tend to the horses and ranch chores. Rose prepared breakfast, and they ate together in the kitchen, their conversation gradually becoming easier as they grew accustomed to one another's company. Preston spent his days working the ranch, training horses, mending fences, checking on his small herd of cattle. Rose kept the house, prepared meals, and began putting her touch on their home. She sewed curtains from the fabric Preston had bought, arranged her few books alongside his many volumes, and started a small kitchen garden behind the house. In the evenings, they often sat in the front room, Rose sewing baby clothes while Preston read or worked on his ledgers. Sometimes he would read aloud to her passages from novels or poetry that she'd never encountered before. Rose discovered that her quiet, practical husband had a deep appreciation for literature that surprised and delighted her. As her pregnancy advanced, Rose found herself growing fond of Preston in ways she hadn't anticipated. He never complained when her condition made her tired or ill. He brought her wild strawberries he found while checking fence lines, built a cradle for the baby with his own hands, and once, when she was feeling particularly uncomfortable, rubbed her swollen feet without her even having to ask. One evening in late June, as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset, Rose found the courage to ask about the photograph she'd seen in his study. Was she your wife? She asked softly. Preston's hands stilled on the piece of harness he was mending. For a long moment he said nothing, and Rose feared she'd overstepped. Yes, he finally answered. Catherine, we were married for just over a year. What happened to her? Rose asked, though she suspected the answer. Childbirth, Preston said, his voice flat. Her and our son both. 7 years ago now. Rose placed a hand over her own swollen belly, understanding now why Preston sometimes looked at her with concern bordering on fear. I'm so sorry. Preston nodded, his eyes on the distant mountains. She was the daughter of a rancher over in Durango. We met at a horse auction, married 6 months later. His hands resumed their work on the harness. She was a fine horsewoman, could outride most men. Rose listened, sensing that Preston rarely spoke of his first wife. The little wooden horse on your desk, was that hers? A ghost of a smile touched his lips. I carved it for her as a wedding gift, not very good, but she kept it on her nightstand. He glanced at Rose. I'm not much of an artist. It's beautiful, Rose said honestly. You must have loved her very much. I did. Preston set aside his work. After they died, I thought I'd never marry again. Didn't see the point in risking that kind of pain twice in one lifetime. He looked directly at Rose. But when I saw you standing there alone yesterday, something changed. I can't explain it exactly. Rose felt tears welling in her eyes. I'm glad you did what you did. I don't know what would have become of me and the baby otherwise. Preston reached across the space between their chairs and for the first time deliberately took her hand in his. His palm was rough with calluses, but his touch was gentle. "You're a strong woman, Rose. You'd have found a way, but I'm glad you're here." They sat in silence as twilight deepened, their hands linked, a new understanding growing between them. As July turned to August, the heat became oppressive. Rose's pregnancy was in its final weeks, and she found herself increasingly uncomfortable. Preston worried about her constantly, though he tried not to show it. One sweltering afternoon, Rose was resting on the porch when the sound of an approaching wagon caught her attention. She struggled to her feet just as a smart buggy pulled into the yard, driven by a well-dressed woman of perhaps 40. "Hello there," the woman called, bringing her horse to a stop. "You must be Mrs. Garrett. I'm Olivia Richards, from the next ranch over." Rose smoothed her dress self-consciously. "Yes, I'm Rose Garrett. Preston's out checking the herd, but he should be back soon." "Oh, I didn't come to see Preston," Olivia said cheerfully, climbing down from her buggy with surprising agility. "I came to meet you, may I?" she gestured to the porch. "Of course," Rose said, a little bewildered by this unexpected visitor. Olivia joined her on the porch, her sharp eyes taking in Rose's advanced pregnancy. "My husband Thomas and I have been neighbors to Preston for 5 years now. When we heard he'd married, well, I had to come see for myself. Preston's always been such a solitary soul since Catherine died." Rose offered the woman a chair. "You knew his first wife, not well," Olivia admitted. "They were only married a short time before the tragedy, but I remember how broken Preston was afterward." She studied Rose with frank curiosity. "And now here you are, about to make him a father after all." Rose felt her cheeks flush. She wondered how much this woman knew about the circumstances of their hasty marriage. As if reading her mind, Olivia smiled kindly. "Small towns breed big gossip, Mrs. Garrett. I've heard the talk, but I don't put much stock in it. Preston Garrett is a good man who makes his own decisions. If he chose to marry you, then you must be a remarkable woman indeed." Relief flooded through Rose. "Thank you for saying that, Mrs. Richards." "Olivia, please," the older woman insisted. "And I meant every word. Now, when is this little one due to arrive?" "Any day now," Rose admitted. "The midwife from town has been out to check on me twice." Olivia frowned. "Old Mrs. Jenkins, she's competent enough, but she's getting on in years. My sister-in-law is a trained nurse who's delivered dozens of babies. She's visiting us right now from Denver. Would you like me to send her over to stay for a few days when your time comes?" Rose felt tears spring to her eyes at this unexpected kindness. "That would be wonderful if it's not too much trouble." "No trouble at all," Olivia assured her. "Thomas and I never had children of our own, but I've helped at enough birthings to know a woman needs support." She patted Rose's hand. "And I suspect Preston will be beside himself with worry when the time comes. Men are useless at such moments." They were still talking when Preston rode into the yard. His expression registered surprise at seeing the visitor, but he dismounted and approached with a polite nod. "Mrs. Richards." "This is unexpected. Preston Garrett, you old bear," Olivia said affectionately. "Married for weeks and you didn't even ride over to tell us. I had to hear it from Hank at the feed store." A faint smile touched Preston's lips. "Been busy, Olivia." "Too busy to introduce your lovely wife to your neighbors. For shame," Olivia rose. "I've been getting acquainted with Rose, and I've offered to send Martha to help when the baby comes." Preston's expression softened with visible relief. "That's mighty kind of you. We'd be grateful." After Olivia left, promising to return soon with her sister-in-law, Preston helped Rose back into the house and out of the heat. "The Richards are good people," he told her. "Thomas is fair in his dealings, and Olivia's been a good neighbor since I moved here." "She was very kind," Rose agreed. "It will be a comfort to have her sister-in-law here when the time comes." She hesitated. "Preston, are you worried? About the birth, I mean." He looked away, but not before she caught the flash of fear in his eyes. "Every birth has risks, but you're especially afraid because of Catherine." Preston sank into a chair, suddenly looking tired. "Yes, I've been trying not to show it, but yes, I'm afraid." Rose moved to stand beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. I'm strong and healthy, Preston, and this time there will be a trained nurse to help, not just the midwife. He reached up and covered her hand with his own. I know, still, I'll breathe easier when it's over and you're both safe. 3 days later, Rose's labor began. Preston rode out at dawn to fetch Mrs. Richard's sister-in-law, Martha, returning with her just as Rose's pains were becoming more intense. Martha proved to be a capable, no-nonsense woman in her 30s who took charge immediately, sending Preston to heat water and then banishing him from the bedroom. Men are no use at times like these, she told him firmly. Go tend your horses or chop wood, we'll call you when there's news. For the next 12 hours, Preston paced the ranch, unable to concentrate on any task for more than a few minutes. Each cry from upstairs sent him into a fresh agony of worry. By sunset, he was standing at the bottom of the stairs, unable to move further away, when a different cry split the air, the thin, outraged wail of a newborn. Preston froze, his heart thundering in his chest. A few moments later, Martha appeared at the top of the stairs, her apron stained but a smile on her face. Congratulations, Mr. Garrett, she said. You have a healthy son, and your wife is doing just fine. Preston sagged against the wall, overcome with relief. Thank God, he whispered. Can I see them? Give me a few minutes to get them both cleaned up, Martha said, already turning back toward the bedroom. When Preston finally entered the bedroom, Rose was propped up against the pillows, her face pale but radiant with exhaustion and joy. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the blankets he'd purchased in town. Preston, she said softly, come meet your son. He approached cautiously, almost afraid to believe that both Rose and the baby had survived. When he reached the bedside, Rose tilted the bundle so he could see the infant's face red and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair and tiny features screwed up in sleep. He's perfect, Preston said, his voice rough with emotion. And you're truly all right, Rose smiled. I'm tired and sore, but yes, I'm fine. She hesitated. Would you like to hold him? Preston had never held a baby before, but he nodded, carefully taking the tiny bundle from Rose. The weight of the infant in his arms was astonishingly light. As he cradled the baby, the boy's eyes fluttered open, revealing dark blue irises that stared unfocused at this new world. Hello, little one, Preston whispered. Something profound shifted in his chest, a fierce, protective love unlike anything he'd ever experienced. What should we name him? Rose asked softly. Preston looked up, surprised. You haven't chosen a name. I thought perhaps we should decide together, she said. He'll carry your name after all. Preston gently returned the baby to Rose's arms. What about William, after your father? Tears sprang to Rose's eyes. You remembered. You mentioned it once, Preston said. William Garrett sounds like a good, strong name. William Preston Garrett, Rose corrected. He should have your name too. Preston swallowed hard against the lump in his throat. Thank you, he said simply. Martha bustled back in then, shooing Preston out so Rose could feed the baby and rest. As he closed the bedroom door behind him, Preston was overwhelmed by the realization that overnight, everything had changed. He had a wife who had survived childbirth. He had a son not of his blood, perhaps, but his in every way that mattered. For the first time in 7 years, Preston Garrett felt something like hope. The next few weeks passed in a blur of sleepless nights and new routines. Little William Will, as they began to call him, proved to be a generally good-natured baby who only fussed when hungry or uncomfortable. Rose recovered her strength quickly, but Preston insisted on hiring a local girl, Jenny Miller, to help with household chores so Rose could focus on the baby. Preston found himself fascinated by his son's development. Each tiny change, the strengthening of Will's neck muscles, the way his eyes began to focus and follow movement, his first real smile seemed miraculous. Though Preston still had a ranch to run, he found himself hurrying through chores to return to the house, drawn by the desire to be near his new family. One evening, as autumn's first chill touched the air, Preston entered the house to find Rose singing softly to Will in the front room. The scene, his wife's golden head bent over their child, the warm lamplight creating a circle of comfort against the gathering darkness outside, struck him with unexpected force. This was what he'd been missing all these years of solitude. This was home in a way his carefully built ranch had never been before Rose arrived. Rose looked up and smiled, and Preston felt his heart turn over in his chest. He'd been so careful to think of their marriage as a practical arrangement, to keep his feelings tightly controlled. But somewhere along the way, without his noticing, he'd fallen in love with Rose Garrett. The realization terrified him. He'd lost one wife, the thought of losing another was unbearable. And Rose had married him out of necessity, not love. She'd been abandoned by the man she loved only months ago. It would be unfair to burden her with his feelings now. "Preston, is something wrong?" Rose asked. Noticing his expression, he shook his head. "No, nothing's wrong, just tired from fixing that break in the north fence." He moved to the kitchen, needing a moment to compose himself. Rose followed him, Will cradled against her shoulder. "You work too hard. Jenny made a stew before she left. Sit down, I'll get you some." Preston did as he was told, watching as Rose expertly held the baby with one arm while serving him dinner with the other. In just a few short months, she'd transformed from the abandoned, frightened woman at the altar to this confident mother and wife who managed their home with quiet efficiency. "Martha says Will is growing faster than most babies his age," Rose commented as she settled in a chair opposite him, still gently patting the baby's back. "He's strong," Preston agreed. "Like his mother." Rose smiled, but a shadow crossed her face. "Preston, there's something I've been meaning to ask you." He set down his spoon. "What is it, when Will gets older? What will we tell him about his father?" The question clearly pained her, but she continued. "I don't want to lie to him, but I don't want him to feel unwanted either." Preston considered the question carefully. "We'll tell him that I chose him, just as I chose you, that some fathers are made by blood and others by choice, but both kinds are real." He reached across the table and touched Will's tiny hand. "He'll never have reason to doubt that I'm his father in every way that matters." Tears welled in Rose's eyes. "How did I get so fortunate, to have found you when I needed you most?" "I'm the fortunate one," Preston said quietly, then quickly added, "to have such a fine son and a good partner to share this ranch with." Rose studied his face for a long moment, as if searching for something. Then she nodded and returned her attention to Will, who was beginning to fuss for his evening feeding. Later that night, Preston sat alone on the porch, staring up at the stars. He needed to keep his growing feelings for Rose in check. She deserved the time and space to heal from Edward's betrayal, to adjust to motherhood, to find her footing in this new life. The last thing she needed was the complication of a husband who wanted more than the practical arrangement they'd agreed upon. He would be patient. He would be kind. He would be the husband and father his family needed. And if Rose never came to love him as he was beginning to love her, well, he would learn to be content with what they had. As autumn deepened toward winter, the ranch settled into a comfortable routine. Preston continued training horses. He had a reputation for producing well-mannered, reliable mounts that brought good prices, while Rose managed the household and cared for Will, who was growing sturdier by the day. Olivia Richards became a regular visitor, bringing small gifts for the baby and welcome female companionship for Rose. Through her, Rose began to meet other ranch wives from the surrounding area, gradually establishing a circle of friends beyond the town of Valentine, where gossip about her hasty marriage had finally begun to fade. One crisp November morning, Preston was working with a spirited 3-year-old colt in the corral when a rider approached the ranch. He immediately recognized Edward Calloway's distinctive sorrel gelding, and his body tensed with a protective anger that surprised him with its intensity. Edward reined in his horse at the edge of the yard, watching Preston with obvious nervousness. He was still handsome in a polished, city way that contrasted sharply with Preston's weathered appearance, but there was a haunted quality to his expression that hadn't been there before. Preston patted the colt's neck and exited the corral, securing the gate behind him. He approached Edward slowly, aware that Rose might look out a window and see who had arrived. "Calloway," he said evenly. "What brings you to my ranch?" Edward dismounted, keeping his distance. "I came to see Rose." "To explain, no," Preston cut him off. "You don't get to explain anything to her, not after what you did." Edward's face flushed. "Look, Garrett, I know what I did was wrong. I panicked. My father was threatening to disinherit me and I ran. It was cowardly, I know that." "Cowardly doesn't begin to cover it," Preston said coldly. "You left a pregnant woman standing alone at the altar. You abandoned your own child." "My father said," Edward began, then stopped himself. "Never mind what he said. I was wrong to listen to him. That's why I'm here now." "I want to make it right." Preston crossed his arms. "It's too late for that. Rose is my wife now. The baby is my son." Edward's eyes widened. "She had the baby, a boy." Something like longing crossed his face. "Can I see him, just once?" "No," Preston said firmly. "You gave up that right when you rode away. Will is my son now in every way that matters." "Will," Edward repeated softly. "She named him William after her father." "We named him," Preston corrected. "William Preston Garrett." Edward flinched at the surname. "Garrett, I understand why you hate me, but please just let me speak to Rose. Let me apologize at least." Preston was about to refuse again when the front door opened behind him. Rose stood there, Will in her arms, her face pale but composed. "I thought I heard voices," she said. "Edward." "What are you doing here?" Preston moved to stand protectively beside his wife. "He was just leaving." "Please, Rose," Edward said, ignoring Preston. "Just give me 5 minutes. I owe you an explanation, an apology." Rose looked at Edward, then at the baby in her arms, and finally at Preston. "Would you take Will inside?" she asked her husband. "I'll speak with Edward out here." Preston hesitated, not wanting to leave her alone with the man who had hurt her so deeply, but he recognized the resolve in Rose's eyes and nodded. "I'll be right inside if you need me," he said, taking Will from her arms. As Preston carried the baby into the house, he heard Rose say coldly, "You have 5 minutes, Edward. Make them count." Inside, Preston paced the front room with Will, unable to settle. Through the window, he could see Rose and Edward talking. Rose's posture was rigid, her arms crossed defensively. Edward appeared to be pleading, gesturing with his hands. At one point, he reached toward her, but she stepped back sharply. After what seemed like an eternity but was probably less than the promised 5 minutes, Rose turned and walked toward the house without looking back. Edward stood for a moment, watching her go, then mounted his horse and rode away. When Rose entered, her face was flushed and her eyes bright with unshed tears. Preston wanted to ask what had been said, but he held his tongue, waiting for her to speak when she was ready. Rose took Will from him, holding the baby close as if drawing comfort from his solid little weight. "He said his father threatened to disinherit him if he married me," she finally said. Apparently, Judge Calloway had plans for Edward to marry a banker's daughter from Denver. When Edward told him I was pregnant, the judge suggested I might be lying about the father. Her voice broke slightly. "As if I'd been with other men." Preston's hands curled into fists. "What did you tell him?" "I told him it didn't matter anymore what his reasons were, that I had a husband who stood by me when he ran away, that my son has a father who chose him." Rose looked up at Preston, her eyes now steady. "I told him to never come back." Preston felt a swell of pride in his wife's strength. "Are you all right?" "Yes," Rose said, and she seemed surprised to realize it was true. "Seeing him, it didn't hurt the way I thought it might. I realized I don't love him anymore. Maybe I never really did." She shook her head. "The man I thought he was never existed." Preston wanted to take her in his arms to tell her how remarkable she was, but he restrained himself. "You handled it well." Rose smiled faintly. "I had to, for Will's sake, and for yours too, Preston. You've given us so much." "I won't let Edward Calloway disrupt the life we're building here." The words, "the life we're building," echoed in Preston's mind long after Rose had taken Will upstairs for his nap. There was something in the way she'd said it, something like commitment, like a choice being made. For the first time, Preston allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, Rose might someday come to feel for him what he was increasingly certain he felt for her. The first snow of winter fell 2 weeks later, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. Preston rose before dawn as usual to tend to the animals, building up the fires in the house before heading to the barn. When he returned for breakfast, stomping snow from his boots on the porch, he found Rose in the kitchen with Will balanced on her hip while she flipped pancakes one-handed. "You're getting good at that," Preston commented, hanging his coat by the door. Rose smiled. "Necessity is a fine teacher. Will doesn't like to be put down much these days." As if to demonstrate, Will gurgled happily and reached pudgy hands toward Preston. Without thinking, Preston took the baby from Rose, settling him naturally against his chest. Will immediately grabbed for Preston's beard, a recent fascination. "Careful there, partner," Preston said, gently disentangling the tiny fingers. "That's attached." Rose watched them with a soft expression Preston couldn't quite interpret. "You're so good with him," she said. "I never expected." "Never expected what?" Preston asked, bouncing Will slightly as the baby began to fuss. "I never expected you'd take to fatherhood so naturally," Rose admitted. "When we married, I thought you were just being kind, offering your name and protection. I didn't realize you'd embrace being a father so completely." Preston looked down at Will, who was now contentedly drooling on his shirt. "Neither did I," he said honestly, "but it's easy to love him." He glanced up and caught Rose's gaze. "He's part of you after all." A flush spread across Rose's cheeks and she turned quickly back to the stove. "Breakfast is ready," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. They ate together as they did every morning, but there was a new awareness between them, an unspoken current that made Preston hyper-conscious of every movement Rose made, every smile she directed at him or Will. After breakfast, Preston reluctantly prepared to head back out to the barn. "The snow's coming down harder. I need to make sure the livestock have extra feed." He hesitated at the door. "Will you be all right here if I'm gone most of the day? The paths might get difficult if the snow keeps up." "We'll be fine," Rose assured him. "I have plenty to keep me busy and Jenny is coming over later to help with the washing." Preston nodded and was about to leave when Rose called his name. He turned back. "Be careful out there," she said softly. "Come home safe to us." The simple concern in her voice warmed him more than any fire could have. "Always," he promised. By midday, the gentle snowfall had transformed into a true blizzard, the wind howling around the corners of the barn as Preston finished securing the horses. He fought his way back to the house. The short distance turned treacherous by whiteout conditions and drifting snow. When he finally stumbled through the front door, he found Rose pacing anxiously in the front room, Will asleep in his cradle nearby. "Preston," she cried, rushing to help him remove his snow-covered coat. "I was so worried. The storm got so bad so quickly." "I'm fine," he assured her, though his fingers were numb with cold despite his heavy gloves. "Just took longer than expected to get everything settled at the barn." Rose helped him to a chair by the fire and knelt to remove his boots. "Your hands are like ice," she scolded gently, taking them between her own much warmer ones. "What were you thinking, staying out so long?" "Had to make sure the animals were safe," Preston said, too distracted by the sensation of Rose's hands rubbing his to form a more coherent response. "Well, now I need to make sure you're safe," she replied. "Sit here and warm up. I'll make you some hot coffee." As Rose moved to the kitchen, Preston flexed his tingling fingers, marveling at the concern she'd shown. It had been a long time since anyone had worried about his welfare, longer still since someone had touched him with such natural care. The blizzard continued through the afternoon and into the night, the wind rattling the windows of the sturdy farmhouse. After dinner, they sat in the front room as usual, but the howling storm outside made the warmth and safety of the house feel more precious somehow. Will was unusually fussy, perhaps disturbed by the noise of the storm. After trying unsuccessfully to settle him, Rose sighed. I think he needs the movement. When he's like this, walking is the only thing that helps. Preston stood. Let me. He took Will from her arms and began to pace the room slowly, speaking quietly to the baby. It's just a storm, little man, nothing to worry about. This house has stood through worse than this. To Rose's surprise, Will began to quiet, his crying subsiding to occasional hiccuping sobs as Preston continued his patient pacing and murmured reassurances. You have the magic touch, Rose said with tired gratitude, sinking onto the sofa. Preston shrugged. He just needed some movement. And maybe a deeper voice that carries over the storm. As Will finally drifted to sleep, Preston carefully lowered himself to sit beside Rose on the sofa, the baby still cradled against his chest. I can take him up to his crib, Rose offered. Let him sleep a bit longer, Preston said. He's comfortable now, no sense disturbing him. They sat in companionable silence, listening to the storm rage outside while the fire crackled in the hearth. Rose found herself studying Preston's profile as he watched the flames, the straight line of his nose, the set of his jaw partly hidden by his neatly trimmed beard, the slight crinkles at the corners of his eyes. Not handsome in the conventional way Edward had been, but appealing in a different, more substantial way. What are you thinking? Preston asked, catching her gaze. Rose hesitated, then decided on honesty. I was thinking how different my life is now from what I imagined it would be a year ago. Better or worse? Preston asked, a hint of vulnerability in his question. Different, Rose said thoughtfully. A year ago, I thought I was in love with Edward. I thought we'd have a conventional life in town with him working at his father's law practice. She looked around the comfortable farmhouse, at Will sleeping peacefully against Preston's chest, at the snow-covered windows that separated them from the wild night. This is wilder, I suppose, less predictable but also more real somehow. Preston nodded slowly. Life on a ranch isn't easy. Especially for a woman used to town living. I was raised on a farm until I was 16, Rose reminded him. When my parents died, I moved to Valentine because I couldn't manage the farm alone, but I've always preferred open spaces to town gossip. Even so, Preston said, this isn't the life you chose, it's the life that circumstances forced on you. Rose turned to face him fully. Preston, do you regret what you did, marrying me, taking on Will? No, he said immediately, his certainty evident, not for a moment. Then why do you assume I must regret it? Rose asked gently. Preston looked down at Will, his large hand carefully cradling the baby's head. Because you had no choice, because I was your only option on that day. Rose was quiet for a long moment, gathering her courage. That day, yes. But every day since then has been a choice, Preston. I choose to be here, I choose this life, I choose. She took a deep breath. I choose you. Preston's head came up sharply, his eyes searching her face. Rose. I know we agreed this would be a practical arrangement, she continued quickly. And I know you might not feel the same, but these past months watching you with Will, seeing the kind of man you truly are, I've come to care for you, Preston, more than I ever thought possible. Preston sat very still, as if afraid any movement might shatter this moment. Are you saying what I think you're saying? Rose nodded, her heart pounding. I'm saying I love you, Preston Garrett, not out of gratitude or necessity, but because of who you are, because you're the best man I've ever known. For a moment, Preston didn't respond, and Rose felt a flash of fear that she'd misread everything, that he still saw their marriage as nothing more than a duty he'd taken on. Then, carefully shifting Will to one arm, Preston reached out with his free hand to cup Rose's cheek. I've been falling in love with you since the day Will was born, he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. But I was afraid to tell you, afraid it was too soon after Edward, afraid you'd feel obligated to return feelings you didn't have. Rose turned her face to press a kiss against his palm. I think I started falling for you the day you stood up for me against Mrs. Turner at the boarding house. No one had ever defended me like that before. Preston smiled, his thumb gently tracing her cheekbone. I wanted to thrash Edward Calloway the moment I saw him ride up to our ranch. That's when I knew for certain how I felt about you, Rose laughed softly. We've been circling around this for weeks, haven't we? Both afraid to speak first. Seems that way, Preston agreed. With a tenderness that made Rose's heart ache, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in their first real kiss, gentle, questioning at first, then deepening as Rose responded eagerly. When they parted, both slightly breathless, Will stirred between them, making a small sound of protest at being slightly squished. Sorry, little man, Preston murmured, adjusting the baby more comfortably. He looked back at Rose, his eyes filled with a happiness she'd never seen there before. I love you, Rose Garrett. You and Will are the best things that ever happened to me. And you're the best thing that ever happened to us, Rose replied, leaning her head against his shoulder as the three of them sat together, a true family at last, safe and warm while the storm raged outside. Spring came to Colorado with a riot of wildflowers and new growth. The ranch flourished under Preston and Rose's combined care, he with the animals and land, she with the expanded kitchen garden and the household. Will was crawling now, getting into everything, his dark hair and bright eyes making him the image of his mother. One warm afternoon in May, Rose was hanging laundry while Will played on a blanket nearby when she spotted Preston riding toward the house. He wasn't expected back from town for hours yet, and she shaded her eyes, wondering what had brought him home early. As he drew closer, she could see he was grinning broadly. He dismounted in a fluid motion and scooped Will up from the blanket, swinging the giggling baby high. What's got you so cheerful? Rose asked, smiling at their antics. Got a letter in town, Preston said, settling Will on his hip. From the Army. They want 20 horses for the cavalry by the end of summer. It's the biggest contract I've ever had. Preston, that's wonderful, Rose exclaimed. Those 2-year-olds you've been training will be perfect. It means we can add on to the house like we talked about, Preston said. Build that extra bedroom and expand the kitchen. Rose's heart swelled at the casual we that now peppered their conversations. Their marriage had transformed over the winter from a practical arrangement to a true partnership built on love and mutual respect. There's something else too, Preston said, suddenly looking nervous. Something I wanted to ask you. What is it? Rose asked, curious about his change in demeanor. Preston set Will back on the blanket with one of his wooden toys, then took Rose's hands in his. I know our marriage had an unusual start. That day at the altar, I offered you my name to save your reputation, but now, he took a deep breath. Now I love you more than I ever thought possible. You and Will are my world, and I was wondering if you'd do me the honor of marrying me again. Rose looked at him in confusion. But we're already married. I know, Preston said, but I thought maybe you might want a real wedding this time. Not one where you're standing alone waiting for someone else, but one where we both choose each other in front of God and the whole town if you want. A fresh start with no shadows between us. Tears filled Rose's eyes. Oh, Preston, yes, I would love that. Preston's face lit up with joy, and he pulled her into his arms, kissing her deeply. Will, noticing his parents' distraction, chose that moment to attempt to crawl off the blanket toward a fascinating dandelion, causing them both to lunge for him at the same time, laughing as they rescued him from his adventure. When should we do it? Rose asked as they settled Will back on the blanket. The wedding, I mean. How about the anniversary of the day we met? Preston suggested. 1 year from when I first made you my wife. Rose nodded, loving the symmetry of it. That would be perfect. On a beautiful June day, exactly 1 year after their hasty first wedding, Rose Garrett walked down the aisle of the small church in Valentine on the arm of Thomas Richards, who had happily agreed to give her away. This time, there was no fear or uncertainty in her heart, only joy as she approached the man waiting for her at the altar. Preston stood tall and proud, his best suit brushed free of the dust that usually covered his ranching clothes. Beside him, Olivia Richards held 14-month-old Will, who was dressed in a miniature suit that matched his father's. The entire town had turned out for the occasion. Even those who had gossiped about Rose's condition and hasty marriage the year before now smiled and dabbed at tears as she passed. In the back row, Rose caught sight of Judge Calloway, his expression unreadable. Edward was not present. She had heard he'd moved to Denver permanently after their confrontation at the ranch. When Rose reached Preston, he took her hands in his eyes full of love and wonder. "You're even more beautiful than the first time we did this," he whispered. "This time I'm marrying the right man," she whispered back. Reverend Thompson, the same minister who had married them a year ago, smiled at the couple. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the renewal of vows between Preston and Rose Garrett. Though they have been legally wed for a year, they wish to reaffirm their commitment before God and this community." The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. When it came time for the vows, Preston spoke first, his voice steady and clear. "Rose, a year ago I offered you my name as shelter from a storm. I had no idea then that you would become the light of my life, the heart of my home. I promise to love you and will all the days of my life, to cherish you as the gift you are, and to thank God every day for bringing you to me on that June afternoon." Rose blinked back tears as she spoke her own vows. "Preston, you saw me at my most vulnerable and offered me strength when I had none left. You became a father to my son, a partner in my life, and the love I never dared to hope for. I promise to stand beside you through every season, to love you with all my heart, and to make a home with you filled with joy and purpose for all our days." When Reverend Thompson pronounced them husband and wife again, Preston kissed her with a tenderness that made the congregation break into spontaneous applause. Will, not to be left out, reached for both his parents, and Preston swept him up into their embrace, the three of them together as a family should be. The celebration afterward was held at the ranch, with tables set up under the cottonwood trees and lanterns hanging from the branches. There was dancing and feasting, laughter and music that lasted well into the evening. Preston and Rose moved among their guests, accepting congratulations and well wishes, while passed from one admiring set of arms to another. As twilight deepened, Preston found Rose sitting on the porch steps, watching the festivities with a contented smile. "Happy, Mrs. Garrett?" he asked, sitting beside her. "Completely," she answered, leaning against his shoulder. "Though I'm looking forward to when everyone leaves and it's just us again," Preston chuckled. "Me too, but it's good to celebrate properly this time." He took her hand, running his thumb over her wedding ring, the same one he'd placed on her finger a year ago, but which now held so much more meaning. "I have something for you." From his pocket, he produced a small velvet pouch. Rose opened it to find a delicate gold locket on a chain. "It's beautiful," she breathed, opening the locket to find a tiny portrait of Will on one side and Preston on the other. "I had it made in Denver," Preston said. "Olivia helped smuggle the photographs to the jeweler without you noticing." Rose kissed him softly. "I love it, and I love you." "I have one more surprise," Preston said, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "I've been thinking, Will's getting bigger now, and the house will soon have that extra bedroom." He took a deep breath. "What would you think about filling it with another little Garrett, a brother or sister for Will?" Rose's eyes widened, then crinkled with joy. "I think that's a wonderful idea. In fact," she placed a hand over her still flat stomach. "I think we might already be on our way to making that happen." Preston stared at her in shock. "Are you saying, are we?" Rose nodded, her eyes shining. "Doctor Matthews confirmed it yesterday. I wanted to tell you tonight after everyone left, but—" She laughed as Preston whooped loudly, drawing curious stares from their guests. "Well, I guess everyone knows now." Preston didn't care who was watching. He gathered Rose in his arms and kissed her thoroughly, his heart so full he thought it might burst. When they separated, he rested his forehead against hers. "Thank you," he whispered. "For our life together, for Will, for this new baby, for everything." "No," Rose said, touching his beloved face. "Thank you for being the man who stepped forward that day and said, 'I'll be your husband.' You saved more than my reputation, Preston. You saved my heart." As their guests began to notice the intimate moment and drifted away to give them privacy, Preston and Rose Garrett sat together on the porch of their ranch home, watching the stars appear overhead. Will slept peacefully inside, and a new life grew within Rose, a family created not from obligation but from the deepest love, forged in difficult circumstances but stronger for having weathered them together. "I'll always step forward for you, Rose," Preston promised softly. "Every day for the rest of our lives." Rose leaned her head against his shoulder, perfectly content. "I know," she said simply. "That's who you are. That's why I love you." And as the night deepened around them, they remained on the porch, talking quietly of their hopes for the future, more children, expanding the ranch, growing old together, all dreams that had seemed impossible a year ago when a pregnant woman was abandoned at the altar, and a quiet cowboy stepped forward to change both their lives forever.